August 17th, 1945. A transport train rattled across the English countryside toward a camp outside York, its wheels grinding against steel rails with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Inside the third-class compartment, Lieutenant Margarete Schreiber pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, watching green fields blur past, and tried to remember how to breathe. She was 24 years old. She had served in the Luftwaffe as a communications officer since 1942. She had survived the Allied bombing campaigns that reduced German cities to ash. She had witnessed the collapse of everything the Third Reich had promised would last 1,000 years. And now, 3 months after Germany's surrender, she was a prisoner of the British. A female prisoner, which meant something specific and terrible in her mind. Her hands trembled in her lap. She had not eaten in 2 days. Not because food wasn't offered, but because her stomach rejected everything except fear. Around her, 11 other German women sat in various states of silent terror. Some were nurses who had served in field hospitals. Others had been Luftwaffe auxiliaries like herself, radio operators, administrative personnel, intelligence clerks. One woman, Oberfeldwebel Anna Koch, had been a concentration camp guard, though she had carefully omitted that detail during her initial processing. None of them spoke. Speech felt impossible under the weight of what they expected was coming. They had been taught, drilled into their consciousness through years of propaganda, that capture by the Allies meant one thing for German women: systematic violation. Revenge for what German soldiers had done across Europe. Retribution for the crimes of the regime they had served. The propaganda had been specific, graphic, designed to ensure that German women would choose death over surrender. Mass suicides on the Eastern Front had proven its effectiveness. But the war was over. Suicide was no longer an option. There were no cyanide capsules left, no convenient cliffs to jump from, no last-stand bunkers where honorable death could be chosen over dishonorable survival. There was only this train, carrying them toward a future they believed they understood completely. Margarete touched the space beneath her collar where she used to wear her Luftwaffe insignia. The British had confiscated it during processing, along with her uniform jacket, replacing it with a coarse gray dress stamped with POW in black letters. She felt naked without the uniform, stripped of identity and protection. Just a woman now. Just prey. The train began to slow. Through the window she could see the camp approaching. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at each corner, British flags hanging limp in the humid afternoon air. The reality of imprisonment was about to begin. She closed her eyes and prayed to a God she wasn't sure existed anymore, asking not for deliverance, but simply for the strength to endure whatever came next. She prayed that death, when it finally arrived, would be quick. She prayed that she would not break too badly before the end. The train shuddered to a halt. The compartment door opened. A British soldier stood framed in the doorway, rifle slung across his shoulder, expression neutral and professional. "Ladies, please gather your belongings and exit the train in an orderly fashion. Welcome to Camp 186. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. My name is Sergeant Davies, and I will escort you to processing." His tone was not cruel. It was not mocking. It was simply courteous. Margarete opened her eyes and looked at him, trying to understand what trap was being set, what psychological torture this politeness was designed to enable. But Sergeant Davies simply stood there, waiting patiently, showing no sign of the brutality she had been promised would define every interaction with Allied soldiers.
This is the story of what happened when Nazi propaganda collided with Allied decency, when women raised to believe in one version of masculinity encountered an entirely different model, when prisoners who expected barbarism found something that shattered every certainty they had carried into captivity. And when the simple act of being treated with dignity became more devastating to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat could ever be. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is not matching it with equal force, but answering it with unexpected humanity. To understand what those women expected when they stepped off that train, you must first understand what the Nazi regime had taught them about enemies, about war, and about their own bodies as weapons in a racial struggle that supposedly defined human existence. Margaret Schreiber had been 16 when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. She had been raised in a middle-class family in Hamburg, her father a banker, her mother a homemaker who believed fervently in National Socialist domestic ideology. Margaret had joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the female branch of the Hitler Youth at age 10, which meant that her formative years were shaped entirely by Nazi gender ideology. That ideology was specific and comprehensive. German women were told they were bearers of racial purity, mothers of the future master race, guardians of Aryan bloodlines that must never be contaminated by inferior peoples. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the Volk, to the nation, to the genetic destiny that Hitler had proclaimed as Germany's ultimate purpose. But this exalted status came with a dark corollary. If German women's bodies were precious vessels of racial purity, then the greatest crime enemies could commit was violating that purity. Nazi propaganda had exploited this reasoning systematically, constructing narratives about Allied soldiers, particularly Soviet soldiers, but also British and American troops, as racial inferiors who would rape German women as deliberate policy to destroy German bloodlines. The propaganda intensified as Germany began losing the war. By 1943, as Allied bombing campaigns reduced German cities to rubble and Soviet forces began their westward advance, Nazi authorities were openly instructing German women to choose suicide over capture. The reasoning was presented as both practical and ideological. Captivity would mean gang rape, followed by murder. So death by one's own hand was simply accepting the inevitable while maintaining control over one's fate. Margaret had absorbed these teachings with the uncritical acceptance that characterized most indoctrination. She had believed because everyone around her believed, because doubt was dangerous, because the alternative, that her government was lying systematically about basic reality, was too destabilizing to contemplate.
To understand what those words meant to Elsa Kruger and the 72 other women standing on that platform, you must first understand what they had been taught about Allied forces and about what capture would mean for German women. The indoctrination wasn't subtle. It wasn't nuanced. It was systematic, repetitive, and designed to ensure that German military personnel, male and female, would fight to the death rather than surrender. Elsa had joined the Luftwaffe Auxiliary in 1941, at age 19, convinced by propaganda that Germany fought a defensive war against Bolshevik hordes from the east and Jewish-controlled plutocracies from the west. Her father had died at Stalingrad. Her older brother had been killed in France in 1944. By the time she volunteered, military service wasn't just duty, it was family obligation, a way to honor the dead by serving the cause they had died for. The training for female Luftwaffe auxiliaries included technical instruction in radio operations, communications protocols, and signal interpretation, but it also included ideological conditioning about what women could expect if Germany lost the war. The instructors were explicit. Allied soldiers, particularly the Americans and British, but especially the Soviets, had no concept of honor regarding women. Rape wasn't a possibility, it was policy. Female prisoners would be violated systematically, then killed or enslaved. The Geneva Conventions were propaganda lies that no nation actually followed. The message was reinforced through every channel. Newspapers published fabricated accounts of Allied atrocities against German women in occupied territories. Radio broadcasts featured testimony from supposed survivors, describing horrors that had never occurred. Films depicted Allied soldiers as savage beasts whose only interest in German women was predatory and violent. And underlying all of it was the racial ideology that formed the foundation of Nazi philosophy. Non-Germanic peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of the discipline and honor that characterized German masculinity. British men were effete and weak, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing. American men were mongrels, products of a degenerate civilization that produced nothing of value. Soviet men were subhuman Slavic hordes without culture or conscience. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. Germans were superior. Therefore, German men possessed unique honor and discipline. Therefore, non-German men lacked these qualities. Therefore, German women could expect only brutality from non-German captors. To surrender was to accept violation. To survive defeat was to endure sustained horror until death provided escape. This wasn't paranoid delusion invented by hysterical propagandists. This was official policy, communicated through chain of command, reinforced by officers at every level. Elsa had been issued cyanide capsules during her final months of service, small glass vials wrapped in protective cloth designed to be crushed between teeth if capture became inevitable. She had sewn them into the hem of her uniform jacket, checked them daily to ensure they remained intact. She had rehearsed the motion. Reach down, grab the fabric, bite through, swallow. 60 seconds to unconsciousness, 5 minutes to death. Better than what surrender would bring.
But the spring of 1945 had moved too quickly for careful planning. The collapse of German defenses accelerated beyond anyone's ability to maintain orderly withdrawal. Elsa's communications unit had been stationed near Hamburg, monitoring Allied bomber formations, coordinating German fighter response that became increasingly futile as Allied air superiority grew absolute. When British forces surrounded the city in early May, her commanding officer had disappeared. No orders came. No instructions for fallback positions or last stands or suicide attacks. On May 3rd, British soldiers had simply walked into the building where Els and 30 other female auxiliaries operated radio equipment. The soldiers had carried weapons, but hadn't fired them. They had shouted in English that nobody understood, then brought forward a German-speaking British officer who explained in calm tones that the war was over, Hamburg had surrendered, resistance was pointless and would be met with overwhelming force. "Lay down your headsets," the officer had said. "Stand up slowly. Keep your hands visible. You are now prisoners of war and will be processed accordingly. Anyone who attempts violence will be restrained with necessary force. Anyone who cooperates will be treated with correct military courtesy. Choose wisely." Els had reached for the cyanide capsules. Her fingers found the spot in her jacket hem where she had sewn them. She had been seconds from crushing the glass when the woman next to her, Greta Hoffman, a 22-year-old from Berlin, had grabbed her wrist. "Wait," Greta had whispered. "Just wait. If they were going to kill us, they would have shot us already. If they wanted to rape us, they wouldn't be standing there talking about processing. Wait and see." So Els had waited. And nothing happened. British soldiers had escorted them out of the building to a temporary holding area in a converted school. They had been searched by female British military personnel, Women's Royal Naval Service members who conducted the searches with professional detachment, removing anything that could be used as weapon, but otherwise treating the German women like humans rather than animals. Food had arrived, not much, but more than Hamburg's starving population was receiving. Medical personnel had checked for injuries and illnesses. Everything had been documented: names, ranks, units, dates of service. The British had been organized, professional, boring in their bureaucratic efficiency. Nothing like the savage barbarism Els had been taught to expect. But she had remained unconvinced. This was temporary, she had told herself. The British were gathering intelligence, assessing vulnerabilities, preparing for whatever they actually planned to do with female German prisoners once the immediate chaos of surrender subsided. The real treatment would come later. Later had become weeks. Weeks became months. The temporary holding area had transitioned to a more permanent facility. More German women had arrived: Luftwaffe auxiliaries, Wehrmacht communications personnel, some nurses,
even a few SS auxiliaries whose presence created tension among prisoners who wanted to distance themselves from the most ideologically committed Nazis.
And throughout it all, British treatment had remained correct. Not kind exactly, but professional. Guards maintained discipline without violence. Food arrived on schedule. Medical care was provided. Female prisoners were segregated from male prisoners and supervised by female British personnel when possible. The Geneva Conventions, which Else had been taught were meaningless propaganda, were apparently real documents that the British actually followed. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Every day that passed without sexual violence or systematic abuse challenged everything Else had been taught. But propaganda has deep roots, and 6 years of conditioning doesn't evaporate because a few weeks pass without catastrophe. She had convinced herself that the British were simply following different timelines, that patience was part of their strategy, that eventually their true nature would emerge. The train journey to this camp had seemed like the moment when facades would drop. Transportation meant vulnerability, isolation from international observers, opportunity for guards to demonstrate the sadism that Else had been promised defined British character. But the guards hadn't entered the passenger car, hadn't leered through the windows, hadn't done anything except ride in separate compartments and maintain professional distance. Even now, standing on this platform, watching British soldiers stand at attention while their captain explained camp regulations in careful German, Else struggled to reconcile observation with expectation. What she was seeing couldn't be real. It violated every certainty she had built her understanding of the world upon. And yet here it was, undeniable, demanding that she either reject the evidence before her eyes or accept that everything she had been taught was false. The camp was designated POW Camp 186, located in Yorkshire, approximately 20 miles from Leeds. It had been constructed in 1943 to house German and Italian prisoners, expanded in 1944 to accommodate increasing numbers as Allied advances in Europe generated more captives than existing facilities could handle. By August 1945, it held approximately 2,800 prisoners, 2,700 men in the main compound, and now these 73 women in a segregated section that occupied roughly 10 acres at the eastern edge of the facility. The segregation was complete. High fencing separated the women's section from the men's. Guard towers positioned at intervals ensured that male prisoners had no visual access to the female compound. The women would eat separately, work separately, exist in a parallel world that shared only administration with the larger male facility.
Captain James Whitmore, the officer who had addressed them on the platform, supervised the initial processing. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, assigned a prisoner number, and interviewed about service history, technical skills, languages spoken, medical conditions, family contacts. British clerks documented everything with meticulous attention to detail that suggested this information mattered, that the prisoners were being treated as individuals, rather than as interchangeable components of a defeated enemy. Ells's interview was conducted by a female British lieutenant, Sarah Crawford, Women's Royal Naval Service, assigned to oversee female prisoner administration. She spoke serviceable German and asked questions with the professional courtesy of someone conducting a job interview rather than interrogating an enemy. Previous occupation before military service. I was a student. University of Munich, Mathematics and Physics. You have technical training? Yes. Radio communications, signal interpretation, and meteorological analysis. Any specialized skills, languages? I speak some French, basic English. I can operate most standard radio equipment. Lieutenant Crawford made notes, glanced up with something that might have been approval. You'll likely be assigned to administrative work or technical support details. We need educated prisoners to help run camp operations efficiently. The work isn't difficult, and it pays a small wage in camp scrip that you can use at the canteen. Wage. The word didn't make sense. Prisoners didn't receive wages. Prisoners worked as forced labor, exploited until they died or became useless. That was how war worked. That was what Germany had done to millions of prisoners and enslaved peoples across occupied Europe. But apparently it wasn't what the British did. The barracks assigned to the female prisoners were simple but adequate. Wooden structures, each housing 20 women in bunk beds, arranged along both walls. A pot-bellied stove in the center for heating. Windows with actual glass. Floors that were clean. Each woman received 2 blankets, a pillow, a set of prison clothing, not uniforms exactly, but standardized dresses and undergarments that fit reasonably well, toiletries, and a small locker for personal possessions.
Personal possessions. Else had none except the clothes she'd been captured in, now taken for cleaning and storage. But the concept that prisoners would be allowed personal items, would have lockers to secure them, suggested a level of respect for individual dignity that contradicted everything she expected. The first meal arrived at 6 p.m. Women filed into a mess hall, another wooden building, larger than the barracks, with long tables and benches. British guards supervised but didn't interact except to maintain order. Food was served cafeteria style: potato soup, bread, margarine, weak tea. Not luxury, but adequate nutrition, more than many German civilians were eating in the chaos of post-war Germany. Else ate slowly, watching for signs of contamination or deliberate poisoning. Around her, other women did the same, tentative, suspicious, unable to simply accept that their captors were providing real food without hidden cruelty. But the soup was warm, the bread was reasonably fresh, and nothing about the meal suggested malicious intent. After dinner, Captain Whitmore addressed the assembled prisoners through Lieutenant Crawford's translation. "You are prisoners of war under British custody. You will be treated in accordance with international law and British military regulations. You will not be subjected to violence, abuse, or sexual assault. Any guard who violates these standards will be prosecuted under military justice. You have the right to report mistreatment through proper channels, and such reports will be investigated. You will be assigned work details appropriate to your skills and physical capabilities. Work is mandatory for all able-bodied prisoners. You will receive fair compensation for your labor. You will be allowed to send and receive mail through the International Red Cross, subject to censorship for security purposes. You will receive medical care when needed. You will be permitted religious observance, consistent with security requirements. You are expected to follow camp regulations, obey lawful orders from guards and administrators, and conduct yourselves with discipline and respect. Violations will be addressed through administrative punishment, loss of privileges, confinement to quarters, reduction in wages. Serious violations will result in more severe consequences. But understand this clearly: you are protected by law. You are not slaves. You are not animals. You are human beings who fought for the wrong side and lost. We won. You lost. But winning doesn't give us license to abandon our principles. Britain is a civilized nation. We treat prisoners accordingly." The speech should have been reassuring. Instead, it deepened Elsa's confusion. She had been prepared for cruelty. She understood cruelty. Cruelty made sense within the worldview she'd been taught. But this insistence on rules and dignity and protection didn't fit. It suggested that the British actually believed what they were saying, that their adherence to Geneva Conventions wasn't performance for international observers, but genuine commitment to principles they considered binding even when inconvenient. That night, lying in a bunk bed in a heated barracks with a full stomach for the first time in months, Else should have felt relief. Instead, she felt terror of a different kind, the terror of recognizing that her entire understanding of the world might be wrong. If the British weren't the barbaric enemies she'd been taught to fear, then what did that say about everything else she'd been told? About German superiority, about Nazi righteousness, about the justice of the war Germany had fought.
She wasn't ready to follow that logic. Not yet. But the questions had been planted, and questions, once asked, don't go away just because you want them to. The transformation of perception happened gradually, through accumulated small experiences rather than sudden revelation. Each day brought new evidence that contradicted propaganda, new interactions that forced recalibration of expectations. The guards were the first surprise. Not because they were kind, kindness would have been suspicious, potentially manipulative, but because they were professional. They maintained discipline without cruelty. They enforced regulations without vindictiveness. They treated female prisoners as prisoners, rather than as women first and prisoners second. Sergeant William Davies supervised the women's work details. He was 42 years old, had served in France in 1940, evacuated from Dunkirk, spent the war years training recruits and managing prisoner facilities. He spoke no German, but communicated through gestures and simple English words that prisoners gradually learned. His approach was consistent: clear instructions, fair expectations, immediate correction of errors without humiliation. One morning in early September, Else was assigned to a work detail maintaining camp gardens, vegetables grown to supplement prisoner rations, reducing British military expenditure on feeding POWs. She worked alongside Greta Hoffman and 8 other women, supervised by Sergeant Davies, who demonstrated proper techniques for weeding and harvesting. Else was clumsy with the gardening tools. She had never done manual agricultural labor. Her movements were awkward, inefficient. She expected rebuke, perhaps physical punishment for incompetence. Instead, Sergeant Davies approached, took the hoe from her hands, demonstrated the proper angle and motion, returned it, and said in simple English, "Like this. Try again. Better next time." No shouting, no humiliation, just instruction and expectation of improvement. The interaction lasted 30 seconds, but challenged months of conditioning about how male authority figures treated women who failed to perform adequately. Lieutenant Crawford, the British officer who supervised female prisoner administration, provided another data point. She conducted weekly inspections of the barracks, checking sanitation, addressing complaints, ensuring that camp regulations were being followed by guards as well as prisoners. She was firm but fair, demanding high standards while acknowledging legitimate concerns. When several women complained that the shower facilities lacked privacy, the shower room had multiple shower heads in one open space, which violated German women's sense of modesty, Lieutenant Crawford didn't dismiss the concern as frivolous. She arranged for installation of canvas curtains to create individual stalls, explaining through a translator, "The Geneva Conventions require that we respect cultural sensitivities when practical. Privacy during bathing is practical. We'll make the modifications." The curtains appeared within a week. A small thing, perhaps, but symbolic. The British were listening, responding to prisoner concerns, treating German women as if their comfort mattered, even though they were defeated enemies with no leverage to demand anything. More surprising still were the interactions with male guards who worked in the segregated women's compound. These men, most of them middle-aged, either too old for frontline service or veterans rotated to rear positions after combat injuries, maintained scrupulous boundaries. They didn't leer, didn't make inappropriate comments, didn't create situations where they were alone with female prisoners unless another guard or Lieutenant Crawford was present. Corporal Thomas Henderson, a 40-year-old guard who had lost his left hand at Al Alamein, supervised evening counts and security patrols. He walked the compound perimeter twice nightly, ensuring fences were intact and prisoners were secure. He was polite when necessary, distant when not, utterly professional in all interactions. One evening in late September, Else was walking the perimeter during permitted recreation time. Prisoners were allowed 90 minutes of outdoor time each evening, weather permitting. She encountered Corporal Henderson conducting his patrol. They walked parallel to each other on opposite sides of the fence for perhaps 50 yards. He nodded acknowledgement. She nodded back. Neither spoke. It was the most ordinary interaction imaginable, and that ordinariness shattered something in Else's mind, because she had been taught that British men, confronted with German women without protection or agency, would be unable to control base instincts, that masculinity without German discipline was inevitably predatory, that men of inferior races lacked the honor to respect female vulnerability. But Corporal Henderson had simply walked his patrol, acknowledged her presence as one would acknowledge any human being, and continued his duties without making the interaction about gender or power or the vulnerability of a female prisoner before a male guard. It was so ordinary it was revolutionary. The medical care provided another shock to expectation. In October, Else developed a severe respiratory infection, probably bronchitis, possibly early pneumonia. She tried to hide it, fearing that illness made her vulnerable, that showing weakness to British medical staff would result in abuse or neglect or experimental treatment without consent.
Dr. Michael Preston, the British military physician who examined Elsie, was perhaps 50 years old, gray-haired and professional. He conducted a thorough examination with clinical detachment, explaining each step through Lieutenant Crawford's translation. He diagnosed bronchitis, prescribed antibiotics and rest, arranged for Elsie to remain in the infirmary until the infection cleared. "You'll recover fully if you follow treatment protocol," he said matter-of-factly. "The antibiotics are American-manufactured penicillin, very effective against bacterial infections. You'll take them 3 times daily for 10 days. Nurse Williams will monitor your progress. Any questions?" Elsie had no questions. She was too stunned to speak. Dr. Preston was treating her like a patient rather than an enemy. He was using expensive medications, penicillin, which Elsie knew was cutting-edge and in limited supply, on a German prisoner. He was providing care that exceeded what most German civilians could access in post-war Germany's collapsed medical system. She spent 5 days in the infirmary. Nurse Williams, a Welsh woman in her 30s who spoke some German, checked on her regularly, ensured she took her medications, brought meals, made conversation about neutral topics like weather and books. She treated Elsie with the same professional courtesy she presumably extended to British patients. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Crawford visited. She sat beside Elsie's bed and spoke in her formal but comprehensible German. "I know this must be confusing for you. Everything you were taught about us was designed to make you fight harder, to make surrender unthinkable. You were told we were barbarians who would abuse female prisoners. You were told we lacked honor and discipline. You were told many lies. We're not perfect. British society has flaws. Our history includes terrible things. But we try to live up to certain standards, especially regarding treatment of prisoners. We won the war. We didn't win by becoming what we fought against. We won by being better. You're going to recover from this infection. You're going to return to your barracks. You're going to continue serving your sentence as a prisoner. But you're going to do it knowing that we treated you with respect when we could have treated you with cruelty. And maybe, when this is all over and you return to Germany, you'll remember that. You'll remember that the British weren't demons, that we were just people who happened to be on the winning side. That's all I ask, that you remember the truth instead of the lies." Lieutenant Crawford left. Elsie lay in her infirmary bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the certainty of 6 years dissolve like smoke.